So this afternoon, I'd like to talk to you about animal diversity, how we make sense of that diversity, and how there's still so much life on Earth to discover. But firstly though, I'd like to do a little thought experiment with you. If you can all stand up for me. Thanks. Now, if I ask you to think of an animal, what is it that springs to mind? Don't shout anything out. If you're thinking of something with fur, then sit down. If you're thinking of something with feathers, sit down. And of something with scales, like maybe a reptile or some sort of fish, then sit down. That's quite a lot you left. Well done. Good. You can all sit down now. That was just a little experiment. Normally when you ask that question, I mean, most people sit down when you say fur, but often I'm really surprised if anyone would be thinking of this sort of creature. This is a thing called... Can we have the lights off, actually, Nick? Can we have the lights off? So this is a thing called a tardigrade. These are commonly known as water bears, or more endearingly, moss piglets. Now, often these are much less than 1 millimetre long, so microscopic. But they're all around us. You could go anywhere in Tunbridge Wells and find thousands, billions of these even. They're everywhere in water films, anywhere on plants, bits of rock, around soil particles. Now, everything about the biology of these animals is absolutely bizarre. They can effectively time travel from one period of favourable conditions to the next by entering a state of suspended animation, where they replace all of the water molecules in their body with a simple sugar called trehalose. And no one's really sure how long they can exist in that state of suspended animation. It's certainly centuries and possibly thousands of years. Also, I'd be very surprised if anyone were thinking of these animals. These are things called Cichliophorans. And these live solely on the bristles growing on the mouth parts of certain species of lobster. And not only that, they periodically shed their entire head and their digestive tract only to grow new ones. And then I'd also be very surprised if anyone was thinking of these. These are things called ribbon worms. Now, ribbon worms, they're the longest animals on the planet. The record is around 55 metres, so about 180 feet. And again, everything about their biology is really peculiar. For example, during the process of metamorphosis, the planktonic larva effectively consumes itself to give rise to the adult, which lives on the seabed. So I've just used these 3 examples here to try and show you that the animals are staggeringly diverse. So far, we've described around 1.5 million animal species, but the estimates for the total number of animal species out there ranges between 10 million and 200 million species. All the familiar animals, all the mammals, all the reptiles, all the amphibians, all the fish, and all the birds, they account for just a tiny, tiny slice of animal diversity. Now, don't get me wrong, I love monkeys and meerkats as much as the next man. But the thing is, I really want people to appreciate the gloriously rich family tree that we're a part of. And I've tried to do this just to try and show people how varied and how remarkable the animals really are. Such as these things. This is, looks a bit like the poster for the usual suspects. These are some of the nematode species that live inside the guts of giant millipedes. These are just a few of the species. Each one of these species has its own little microhabitat or niche within the gut inside the millipede. And there's also a specialist predatory nematode that feeds on these nematodes. So there's a whole community of animals living in this tiny habitat. Also this animal, this is the thing called a Siphonophore. These are quite closely related to things like jellyfish. But what looks like a single individual in this photograph is actually a colony made up of genetically identical units, each of which has become specialised for a particular role, whether it's swimming, feeding, or reproducing. So in these animals, it is the colony that is the individual. And there's also these weird things. This is the constellation of sub 1 millimetre, so microscopic animals that live in between and on the sediment grains on the seabed. Now, for a long time, it was assumed that this habitat supported very few species. But it turns out this habitat is home to a huge variety of animal life, and also it's integral to the functioning of marine ecosystems. So then it's true to say that in terms of their appearances and also their lifestyles, the animals are nothing short of mind-boggling. But why is it though? Why is it that we've only scratched the surface of understanding animal diversity? Firstly, is that most animals are really small. I mean, most animals are much, much smaller than us, like this image nicely shows. And so unless we're specifically looking for them, we simply don't notice them. Secondly, we tend to be drawn to those animals that we feel an emotional attachment to, either because of the way they look or the way they behave. But the thing is, most animals are faceless, and there are lots that don't even have a head. And so in terms of their appearances and their lifestyles, they're very alien to us. I mean, it's much easier to identify with a lioness and the challenges she faces nurturing her cubs on the plains of Africa than it is to identify with a faceless crustacean that spends most of its life attached to the eye of a fish. Everyone always likes that one. Thirdly, few things are what they seem. Simply relying on the way an animal looks can completely confound our attempts to figure out what's what. And that in part is linked to the popular preconception of what evolution is. Evolution to most people is a simple one-way process where simple forms give rise to progressively more complex forms. And so it's become ingrained that simple forms must be primitive. But in actual fact, evolution can just as easily move in the opposite direction. And in adapting to a particular niche, an animal can lose some, if not most, of the complexities of its ancestors. Now, this simplification process, it's also known as degeneration. I don't really like using the term degeneration because that somehow implies that these animals are inferior or somehow less evolved, which is absolute rubbish. There are lots of examples of this. You only have to think of things like blind cavefish or snakes. Blind cavefish have lost their eyes, snakes have lost their limbs. But there are also some really nice examples of this simplification process, and it's thrown up some really bizarre animals, such as this thing here. Now, going on appearances alone, you might assume this is something that's been coughed up by another animal, or some sort of weird worm, perhaps. But this is actually a type of crustacean. On the right down there, it's a type of copepod, and on the right down there is what a copepod typically looks like. But this animal, Sarcotaces, doesn't have any appendages of any kind. It doesn't even have any sense organs. It's become little more really than a bag for feeding and reproducing, and that's because it's a parasite. And in adapting to life inside another animal, it's lost many of the complexities of its ancestors. So as a juvenile, I should say, that Sarcotaces burrows through the skin of a fish, and it stimulates the tissues of the fish to produce a cyst-like bag in which it lives and through which it accesses the fish's blood. But the really weird thing about these is the sexual dimorphism. So that thing at the very top there you can see is the male. Okay? That's the male. So whenever you're feeling really sorry for yourself, just spare a thought for this little chap, because he spends nearly his entire life pressed up against the inside of that cyst by the relatively enormous blob-like female. That's quite a meagre existence indeed. This is another really nice example of evolution's meandering ways. This is a thing called a dicymid. This is about as simple as any animal can be. There are no more than around 50 cells in the body of the adult. There are no organs of any kind. There's not even a gut. It's become little more really than a filament for feeding and reproducing. And this simplicity had zoologists scratching their head for a very long time because they just couldn't figure out what it was. But it turns out this simplicity belies a rich evolutionary heritage. And again, in adapting to life inside another animal, this creature has lost nearly all of the complexities of its ancestors. Not only that, these animals live solely in the kidneys of octopuses and cuttlefish, where they're bathed in pee the whole time. But they appear to have gone beyond the point of parasitism, where they actually benefit the host by helping it to process its urine. That gives you an idea of how long that association is between those two animals. So these curious, weird animals that are difficult to classify aside, since we've been able to sequence DNA, it's completely revolutionised the way we make sense of animal diversity. There's just a diagram there to show DNA and all that. So since we've been able to sequence DNA, it's completely revolutionised the way we make sense of animal diversity. But the thing is, simply adding to the species count, working out how things related to one another, is really the thin end of the wedge in terms of studying biodiversity. To fully appreciate biodiversity, we need to know how animals live and how they interact with one another. And it's these interactions that have always really fascinated me, and I suppose that's what got me interested in zoology in the first place. Now I'd like to introduce you to some of the animals that did get me interested in zoology in the first place. These are the insects and arachnids. And I implore all of you during the summer months to get out and explore, even if it's in your garden. There are nature reserves around Tunbridge Wells, because it's among these smaller animals that you see these really bizarre appearances and remarkable life histories. Take this one here. This is a dung beetle from Peru, from the deep dark forests of Peru. And it's not really for me to criticise the lifestyle choice of others, but I think this beetle has taken things a bit too far. Because it spends a considerable amount of time clinging to the fur around a monkey's bum. And it does that to get first dibs on the monkey poo. Because dung poo, whatever you want to call it, is such a precious resource that animals will go to great lengths to get to it first. And this animal goes right to the very source of it. And you can see about 3-4 individuals clustered around the bum of that TT monkey in Peru. There's also this animal here. At the bottom right here is a thing called a Pseudo Scorpion, a type of arachnid. They're very, very diverse, very abundant, but because they're small, probably none of you have ever seen one, I'd imagine. Who knows? Has anyone seen one of these? No? Okay. Pseudo scorpions, because they're small and they don't have wings, they've come up with some really unusual ways of getting to new areas of habitat. This thing here on the right uses the big beetle up there, which is called the Harlequin beetle, as a sort of taxi service. I found that bit of that Harlequin beetle in Trinidad in 2002, and on its back were 6 of these pseudo scorpions. But what were they doing there? So it turns out that the Harlequin beetle, as a grub, lives in the dead and decaying branches of fig trees, a habitat it shares with the pseudo scorpion. The pseudo scorpion's there, scurrying on the surface of these dead and decaying trees, looking for small animals to eat. But when one of these beetles emerges as an adult, the pseudo scorpions try and clamber aboard. But what's really interesting is that one of the larger male pseudo scorpions completely monopolises that service, and he won't allow any of the males onto the back of the beetle. He'll only allow females in the hope of mating with them during transit to the new area of habitat when the beetle takes off to search for a new fig tree. And there's also, as if bum-clinging beetles and beetle-riding pseudoscorpions weren't enough, there's also this creature. This is a thing called it's a type of parasitoid wasp, a trigonellid. Now, parasitoid wasps are extremely diverse. There's probably at least 500,000 species, only a fraction of which are known, which is a shame because they're extremely important in all terrestrial ecosystems because they help to regulate the populations of so many other animals. This species, though, I should say that actually, parasitoids, unlike parasites, they kill their hosts. But this one, though, has opted for something of a lottery lifestyle because it uses its hole punch-like abdomen at the back there to deposit its flattened eggs in the margins of leaves in the hope that they'll be eaten by a caterpillar. If they are eaten, that's a very big if. They're swallowed, and the larvae tunnel out of the caterpillar's gut into its body cavity. And that in itself isn't all that interesting because lots of parasitoid wasps develop in the same way. But the caterpillar is not the host of this animal. The host of this animal are other parasitoids that are already living inside the caterpillar. So for this thing to complete its life cycle, not only must its eggs be inadvertently consumed by the right sort of caterpillar, that caterpillar must already be infected by the right sort of parasitoids. And almost to underline the long odds of that strategy, this wasp, the females have to lay thousands of eggs, and the adults are very rare, just because there's a small chance of any one of those eggs reaching adulthood. What have we got next? Oh yeah, so the profusion of species we share the planet with, their connectedness, and the fact that we still know very little about these things brings me to one final point. And that is, people tend to assume that there's nothing left to discover in terms of life on Earth, which is sort of summed up in this quote from a book. And today we still grasp at straws and willing to admit that we've wrung most of the mystery out of the world. Now, I love finding quotes like this, and you find them all over. I love finding quotes like this because they're utter rubbish. The fact is, even in the 21st century, there's enormous scope for exploration and discovery. And I'd even argue that we're living in a new golden age of discovery because new technology is enabling us to look at the natural world in completely new ways. I've been lucky enough to go to some really interesting places looking for new animals. This is me in front of a light trap in deepest, darkest northern Burma. If you love insects, this is the best place to be, in front of a light trap. You're surrounded by hundreds, possibly thousands of species, many of which you haven't seen before. If you hate insects, this is probably the worst place you could ever be. You get insects in your mouth and your nose and your ears and your pants and your socks, everywhere. You can be pulling interesting specimens out of nooks and crannies for days afterwards. Well, that's one of the good things about being a zoologist. So yeah, this is one of the things I found on a recent expedition to Burma. Can anyone guess what this is? Shout out. Exactly, but it's actually a clear-winged moth that's pretending to be a wasp. And the subtlety of its mimicry was incredible, not only in terms of the way it looks, but also its behaviour. Its flight, for example, was incredibly wasp-like. And I know my insects well, but I did a double take the first time I saw this. This is a new species, but nothing I collected, and that's all we know, we've got the specimen. Nothing is known about the ins and outs of this animal's biology and the other organisms it interacts with. This is something else I found in northern Burma. This is a thing called a mantis fly. The way I found this one is just really peculiar. It was almost like it wanted to be found. We were playing a weird game of musical statues with some eastern hulock gibbons to try and get some footage of them. These animals are so alert that you can't get anywhere near them. So when they were singing, we could run a little bit closer through the undergrowth to try and get some footage. But as soon as they stop singing, you have to be completely still. Otherwise, they're just off. And it was during one of these motionless pauses that this thing flew into my face. I took one look at it and realised it was something special, and so I collected it. It turns out this is a new genus of mantis fly. Mantis flies are really odd because as larvae, they live as parasitoids in the egg sacs of spiders where they feed on the baby arachnids. But again, the ins and outs of this species' biology are completely unknown. We have the specimen and that's it. So, I mean, also I'd like to add with these ones is that they seem to be able to exist at very low population densities. I could go back to the same bit of forest in northern Burma and spend a month looking for that same species again and never see it. They seem to be able to exist at very, very low population densities. So these two recent finds, they really underline for me that whatever most people think, the fact is the Earth is still full of mystery. And that's something that I find really heartening and really exciting. Anyone with a willingness to explore can and will discover new things, but we need to fight tooth and nail to protect the natural world to make sure that those mysteries aren't extinguished. Thank you very much.